The ballroom of the Westchester Country Club was glowing with crystal chandeliers, white roses, and hundreds of guests from New York's business world. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, the bride, smiling beside her new husband, Andrew. Then she saw her father. David Carter had arrived in a simple dark suit, carrying a small gift wrapped in old-fashioned paper. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He had only come to see his daughter get married. But Emily's smile immediately disappeared. She walked toward him and lowered her voice. "Dad, why did you come dressed like that?" David looked at his suit. "What's wrong with it?" Emily glanced around at the guests. "Nothing. It's just, this is a very important wedding. There are executives here. Investors. People from Andrew's family." David smiled gently. "I'm your father. I wouldn't miss your wedding for anything." Emily looked uncomfortable. "Please don't make this difficult." Before David could answer, her mother approached and whispered, "Maybe you should stay near the back." David felt a strange pain in his chest, but he nodded. "Of course." He moved away from the family table and sat alone near the ballroom doors. A few minutes later, Emily's new father-in-law, Richard Caldwell, walked past him without saying a word. Richard was the founder of one of New York's largest private investment firms. Everyone in the room seemed to know him. David simply watched. Later, just before the wedding reception began, Emily came back. This time, she wasn't smiling. "Dad, I need you to leave." David stared at her. "Leave? Please. You're making people uncomfortable." David looked toward the ballroom. "How am I embarrassing you?" Emily swallowed. "People here expect a certain image. You don't understand how this world works." David's eyes filled with disappointment. "I worked 40 years to give you a good life." Emily looked away. "And I appreciate that, but tonight isn't about your past." David slowly stood. He picked up his gift and walked toward the exit. As he reached the doors, he stopped and looked back at his daughter. "Emily, one day you'll understand something. Never judge a person by what they choose to wear." She said nothing. David stepped outside into the cold New York evening. His driver was waiting. The driver opened the rear door and asked, "Where to, Mr. Carter?" David looked back at the grand ballroom. "Home." Then he smiled faintly. "But before that, call Manhattan. Tell the CEO the wedding is over." The driver froze. "Which CEO?" David looked directly at him. "Richard Caldwell." For the first time that night, David's expression changed completely. The quiet father Emily had just humiliated was gone. The man sitting in that car was someone her entire new family had been trying to reach for years. And tomorrow morning, they were going to discover exactly who he was. The next morning, Manhattan woke to a completely different story. At 8 a.m., David Carter walked into the glass headquarters of Caldwell Capital wearing the same dark suit he had worn to his daughter's wedding. The receptionist immediately stood. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." David nodded. "Is Richard here?" "Yes, sir. He's waiting for you." Upstairs, Richard Caldwell paced beside the windows. "David, I heard about the wedding," he said. David placed a folder on the desk. "Then you know why I'm here." Richard opened it and froze. Inside was a confidential acquisition plan for Caldwell Capital, along with documents showing that someone inside the company had been secretly selling information to a competing investment firm. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked. David sat down. "From the same people who tried to make me look like a nobody last night." Richard shook his head. "Emily?" David nodded. "Your son Andrew and several members of your family have been working with one of my competitors for months." Richard stared at the papers. Andrew's name was there. So was the name of Richard's chief financial officer. David continued, "They plan to use your daughter's marriage to connect the families, then push me out of a deal I've been building for years." Richard looked confused. "Why would they need you out?" David smiled faintly. "Because they don't know who I am." For years, David had stayed out of public attention. His investments were held through private trusts, and his name rarely appeared in business magazines. Richard knew the truth. David Carter wasn't simply an investor. He was the majority owner behind several private funds controlling billions of dollars across New York. Richard whispered, "They embarrassed the wrong man." David answered, "They didn't embarrass me. They exposed themselves." Then he opened another folder. Inside were emails, bank transfers, and messages between Andrew and the CFO. They had been planning to push Richard out of his own company after completing a merger. Emily's role was simple: keep David away from the wedding's business guests and make sure he looked insignificant. Richard's face hardened. "They used my son too." David corrected him. "No. Your son made his own choices." Richard looked toward Manhattan. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," David said. "I want you to let them think their plan worked." Richard understood. David wasn't going to expose them yet. He would let them move further, because every step would create more evidence. Then David received a text: "Mr. Carter, Andrew and Emily are meeting the CFO at a private club tonight." David looked at Richard. "Perfect." Richard asked, "What are you going to do?" David picked up the folder. "I'm going to give them exactly what they think they want." The private club in Midtown was almost empty when Emily, Andrew, and Richard's CFO, Thomas Reed, arrived that evening. They believed they were meeting to finalize a plan that would change the company forever. Andrew lowered his voice. "Once David is pushed out, Richard will have no choice but to accept the merger." Thomas smiled. "And you'll become the new face of Caldwell Capital." Emily looked nervous. "What about my father?" Andrew laughed. "He embarrassed you at the wedding. Let him stay embarrassed." They had no idea David was listening from a private room upstairs. He had arrived with Daniel, his attorney, and 2 investigators. David looked through the glass and watched his daughter laugh at a joke Andrew made. For a moment, the anger disappeared and only disappointment remained. Daniel whispered, "We can stop this now." David shook his head. "Not yet. I want every word." Downstairs, Thomas placed a contract on the table. "After the merger, the voting shares will be transferred." Andrew signed the first page. Emily leaned closer. "And David?" Thomas replied, "He'll be offered a small settlement and pushed out quietly." Andrew smiled. "He'll take it. He thinks I'm just his son." Those words made David close his eyes. Thomas continued, "There's one problem. The controlling shares are held through a private trust. We need the trustees' approval." Andrew looked confident. "I already solved that." He pulled out a document and placed it on the table. "I have a signature." David's eyes narrowed. The signature appeared to belong to him. Andrew had forged his approval. David quietly handed Daniel his passport records proving he was overseas on the date shown. Downstairs, Thomas raised his glass. "To the new Caldwell Capital." Suddenly, the door opened. David walked in. Emily's face went pale. Andrew stood up. "Dad?" David looked at the document. "You should have checked the signature more carefully." Andrew froze. "What are you doing here?" David pulled out a chair. "I came to see how my family planned to steal a company they never owned." Thomas reached for his phone, but the investigator beside David stopped him. "Don't." Emily whispered, "Dad, please listen." David looked at her. "I listened last night. Tonight, you're going to listen to me." He placed a folder on the table. Inside were copies of their messages, transfers, and agreements. Andrew stared at the pages. David leaned forward. "You wanted me out. You wanted my signature. You wanted my daughter's loyalty. Now you're going to get something else." He slid another document across the table. "A board meeting. Tomorrow morning." Andrew looked down at the forged signature. David smiled. "And this time, everyone will know who the real owner is." The next morning, Caldwell Capital's boardroom was packed. Executives, attorneys, and major shareholders had been called in for an emergency meeting. Andrew arrived confident he could still control the situation. Emily sat beside him, avoiding eye contact with her father. Richard Caldwell entered with David. Everyone stood. The chairman looked at Andrew. Mr. Carter, we need an explanation for the documents submitted yesterday. Andrew immediately blamed David. My father is angry because he feels humiliated. Those papers don't prove anything. David placed a folder on the table. Let's look at them together. Daniel handed copies to every director. One showed Andrew's secret merger agreement. Another showed payments to Thomas Reed. The third was the forged ownership approval. A director stared at Andrew. Is this your signature? Andrew swallowed. Yes, but you don't understand. Daniel replied, then explain it. Andrew claimed the deal was only an investment strategy and the forged signature was an assistant's mistake. Daniel interrupted. We checked the metadata. The document was created on Mr. Reed's computer and sent from Mr. Carter's private email. Thomas immediately stood. This is ridiculous. Richard looked at him. Sit down. The room went silent. Then David placed one final recording on the screen. It was the conversation from the private club. Andrew's voice filled the room. Once David is pushed out, we control everything. Emily looked down. Hearing herself, she began to cry. Andrew turned toward her. You told him? She shook her head. No. Dad already knew. David looked at his daughter. I didn't care about your marriage. I needed to know who my daughter trusted. Emily whispered, Dad, I was wrong. David nodded. You were fooled. He made a choice. Andrew suddenly stood. You think you're better than me because you have money? David looked directly at him. No. Money has nothing to do with this. Andrew shouted, then why are you doing this? David answered quietly, because you tried to take something that wasn't yours. The chairman called a vote. Andrew was removed from his position and Thomas was suspended pending investigation. Richard looked at David. What about Emily? David remained silent. Then he said, she's my daughter. She deserves a chance to decide who she wants to become. Emily burst into tears. Andrew looked around, realizing his plan had collapsed. But David wasn't finished. He turned toward Andrew and placed a small envelope on the table. You wanted my signature so badly. Andrew opened it. His face went pale. Inside was a legal notice showing that David had already transferred his controlling interest into a protected family trust. Andrew had lost the one thing he thought he was about to control. The boardroom emptied, but Andrew remained frozen in his chair. The envelope David had given him was still open. What does this mean? Andrew asked. David answered calmly, it means you were trying to steal control of a company from a man who no longer owns the shares you were targeting. Andrew looked at Richard. You knew about this? Richard shook his head. I knew David had a private structure. I didn't know the details. Andrew turned to his father. Why hide all this from me? David stared at him. Because every time you saw money, you saw an opportunity. I wanted you to build a life without depending on mine. Andrew laughed bitterly. And now you're punishing me because I tried to build something. David replied, no. I'm stopping you because you tried to destroy someone else's life to get it. Daniel entered with another folder. David, we received the forensic report. The report showed Thomas Reed had been moving confidential company information to a competitor for nearly 18 months. But there was another discovery. Several payments had gone directly into an account controlled by Andrew. Andrew shook his head. That account was for consulting work. Daniel replied, the company you supposedly consulted for has no employees, no office, and no business activity. Andrew's face changed. Emily looked at him. You lied to me too. Andrew said nothing. Richard finally spoke. You weren't just trying to take David's shares. You were preparing to take mine. Andrew lowered his head. The investigation was now much bigger than a family dispute. Federal investigators requested the records, and the board suspended Andrew from all company activities. Emily followed David into the hallway. Dad, I know I hurt you. David stopped. You did. She wiped away a tear. I thought you were trying to control everything. Andrew told me you were jealous of Richard's family. David looked at her sadly. I wasn't jealous. I was protecting you from people who wanted access to you. Emily asked, can you ever forgive me? David didn't answer immediately. Forgiveness isn't something I can promise today. Trust has to be rebuilt. Emily nodded. Meanwhile, Andrew walked into the elevator alone. He believed losing his position was the worst thing that could happen. He was wrong. On the lobby screen, a breaking business report appeared. Caldwell Capital announces internal fraud investigation. Andrew stared at it. Then his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. A man's voice said, Andrew, you need to leave New York tonight. Andrew asked, who is this? The caller replied, someone who knows what happened to the missing money. The line went dead. Andrew looked toward the glass doors. He realized someone else had been controlling the game. Andrew left the lobby and called the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. He drove to the private apartment he shared with Emily. When he arrived, she was already packing a suitcase. Where are you going? Andrew asked. Emily turned. Away from you. Andrew stared at her. Emily, listen. Everything that happened today can be explained. She shook her head. No, it can't. I heard the recordings. I saw the transfers. You lied to me. Andrew stepped closer. I did it for us. Emily laughed bitterly. You did it for yourself. Before Andrew could answer, his phone rang again. This time, the caller left a message. You have 24 hours to return what you took. If you don't, the documents go to the authorities. Andrew's face went pale. He immediately called Thomas Reed, but Thomas's attorney answered. Mr. Reed is not available. Andrew whispered, tell him I need to speak with him. The attorney replied, you should be more worried about yourself. Andrew sat down. He finally understood that Thomas had not been the mastermind. Someone had been using both of them. David was in Richard Caldwell's office with Daniel. Daniel placed a new report on the desk. We traced the anonymous call. David looked up. Who made it? Daniel answered, the call came through a private server, but the payment for that server came from an account connected to Margaret's old trust. David froze. Again. Daniel nodded. And there's more. He opened another file. 3 years before Margaret died, she created a second investment structure. She never told you about it. David stared at the papers. Why would she hide something from me? Daniel replied, maybe she wasn't hiding it from you. Maybe she was hiding it from someone else. David looked at the account records. One name appeared repeatedly, Andrew. My son. Daniel nodded. But these transactions began before Andrew joined Caldwell Capital. Richard looked confused. Then how could he be involved? Daniel turned the page. He may not have been. Someone used his identity. David stood. Find out who. Daniel discovered a connection between Margaret's secret account and a private foundation in New Jersey. The foundation had one director. David recognized the name immediately. It belonged to Margaret's younger sister, Laura. But Laura had died 5 years earlier. David stared at the screen. Someone has been operating under dead people's names. Daniel nodded. And whoever is doing it has access to old family records. The betrayal was no longer just about his daughter's wedding or a company takeover. Someone had been manipulating his family for years. Sarah called. Dad, I found something in Mom's old apartment. David asked, what? Sarah whispered, a locked box. And there's a note on it with your name. Sarah's message made David leave the office immediately. He drove to the apartment where Margaret had lived during her final months. Sarah was waiting beside a small wooden box. Mom told me never to open it unless something happened to you, she said. David stared at the handwritten note. It read, David, if you are reading this, trust Daniel, but question everyone else. He unlocked the box. Inside were old photographs, a USB drive, bank statements, and a sealed letter. Margaret had written that she discovered someone inside the company was secretly using family information to move money through private trusts. She didn't know exactly who was responsible, but she believed the person had access to old legal documents and family identities. She warned David never to confront that person without evidence. Daniel examined the USB drive. This could contain everything. They took it to his Manhattan office and opened the files on an isolated computer. The first folder contained financial records dating back nearly 4 years. The second contained copies of Margaret's private correspondence. The third folder was labeled, Caldwell. David opened it and saw something shocking. Richard Caldwell had secretly transferred money to Margaret's trust shortly before her death. David looked at Richard when he arrived. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard answered, "Because Margaret asked me not to. She believed someone was watching your family." David's anger faded. "Who?" Richard shook his head. "She never told me." Daniel opened another file. It contained security footage from a private Manhattan office. The video showed Thomas Reed meeting a woman David immediately recognized. It was Laura's former assistant, someone who had worked for Margaret years ago. David whispered, "She disappeared after Margaret died." Daniel enlarged the image. "Her name is Evelyn Grant." David remembered her. Evelyn had been Margaret's most trusted financial assistant. She had access to every account, trust document, and family signature. Then they saw something worse. The footage showed Evelyn handing Thomas a folder marked, Carter Family Estate. David realized the scheme had been planned long before Derek ever entered their lives. Andrew had been manipulated. Thomas had been paid. Even the wedding humiliation had been part of a larger strategy to isolate David from his daughter. Daniel looked at him. "We can expose Evelyn now." David shook his head. "Not yet." Sarah stared at him. "Dad, what are you waiting for?" David closed the laptop. "I want her to believe we still don't know." Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "Your daughter has the box. Take it back before midnight." David looked at Sarah. Someone knew they had found it. David moved Sarah to a secure Manhattan apartment. Daniel contacted investigators, but David refused to hand over the USB drive. "If Evelyn knows, she'll disappear," he said. Another message arrived, "Bring the box to the old warehouse in Red Hook. Come alone." Sarah looked frightened. "Dad, don't go." David smiled. "I'm not going alone." Daniel arranged surveillance as David entered carrying the box. The building was dark. Evelyn Grant stepped from the shadows. "You found the box," she said. David watched her. "You knew Margaret." Evelyn smiled. "Better than you think." David placed the box down. "Why did you do this?" Evelyn's expression hardened. "Because Margaret promised me a place in the company and then removed me when she discovered what I was doing." David replied, "You were stealing." Evelyn shook her head. "I took what I believed I deserved." She admitted creating false trust documents, copying signatures, and moving money through old family records. She had recruited Thomas and manipulated Andrew through him. Derek had been chosen because he was desperate for money and close to Emma. "The wedding was your idea?" David asked. "Yes. I needed you isolated. If Emily believed you were a nobody, she would stop trusting you." David's face hardened. "You used my daughter to destroy my family." Evelyn answered, "Your family was already weak. I simply gave them reasons to turn against each other." David opened the box. "Then you made one mistake." Evelyn frowned. "What?" David pressed a button on his phone. The lights suddenly came on. Investigators entered from both sides. Evelyn froze. David had never come alone. The conversation had been recorded. Evelyn looked at him. "You set me up." David replied, "No. You set yourself up when you came here." Investigators placed her under arrest and secured the documents. Before leaving, Evelyn smiled. "You think this is over?" David stared at her. "What else is there?" She whispered, "Ask Margaret why she kept one account hidden from you." Daniel checked the USB drive. One folder was encrypted. The password hint was Margaret's wedding anniversary. They unlocked it and found a video recorded by Margaret shortly before her death. She looked tired but calm. "David, if you're watching this, then Evelyn has finally exposed herself. But there is something I never told you. The money she was searching for was never in the trust." David watched in silence. Margaret continued, "I moved it somewhere no one would think to look. I did it because I knew someone inside our family would eventually try to take it." Then she named the person who had been protecting it all these years. David's face changed. It wasn't Daniel. It wasn't Richard. It was someone he had trusted more than anyone. David stared at the screen. Margaret had named Sarah. Sarah looked at him, confused. "Dad, what does Mom mean?" Margaret explained that years earlier, she had created a private education fund in Sarah's name and placed the family's most valuable liquid assets inside it. The fund could not be accessed by David, Evelyn, Thomas, or any future spouse. "I chose our daughter because I knew she would never use money to control this family," Margaret said in the recording. Sarah began crying. Then Margaret revealed the final condition: if anyone tried to obtain the fund through fraud or coercion, every document connected to that attempt would automatically be released to an independent trustee and the authorities. Daniel slowly smiled. That's why Evelyn kept searching for the account. She knew it existed, but she never knew where Margaret placed it. The entire scheme suddenly became clear. Evelyn had spent years trying to find the money. Thomas had helped her from inside the company. Andrew had been manipulated into helping them. Derek had been brought in to pressure Emma. And the wedding humiliation had been designed to make David look powerless while they isolated his family. But there was still one unanswered question. David looked at Sarah. "Did Mom ever tell you about the fund?" Sarah shook her head. "Never." Daniel opened the encrypted folder again. Hidden inside was a list of every person who had tried to access the account. David recognized several names, but one shocked him. Richard Caldwell was listed as an attempted beneficiary. "Richard?" David immediately called him. Richard answered nervously. "David, I can explain. You knew about the fund." Richard was silent. "Margaret asked me to help protect it," he finally admitted. "But I never tried to take it." David demanded, "Then why is your name there?" Richard explained that Evelyn had once used his identity to request information about the trust. He had reported it to Margaret, who asked him to stay silent until they had proof. Richard had never betrayed him. He had been helping Margaret from the beginning. Then Daniel received an alert. The independent trustee had triggered the release clause. Every forged document, payment record, recording, and communication connected to the scheme was now being sent to investigators. Evelyn, Thomas, Andrew, and Derek could no longer hide behind excuses. Their own actions had created the evidence that would destroy the entire operation. Sarah looked at her father. "Is it finally over?" David shook his head. "Almost." He picked up Margaret's photograph. "There's one thing left." Sarah asked, "What?" David looked toward Manhattan. "We need to decide what happens to everything they tried to steal." David returned to Caldwell Capital the next morning with Sarah beside him. The boardroom was filled with investigators and attorneys. David placed Margaret's final documents on the table. "My wife spent years protecting this family. Today, we finish what she started." The independent trustee confirmed that the family assets were protected and every fraudulent claim had been invalidated. Evelyn's network was exposed. Thomas agreed to cooperate, Derek faced fraud charges, and Andrew was forced to answer for his role. But David refused to celebrate. He looked at Sarah. "Your mother never wanted this money to become a weapon." Sarah nodded. "Then what do we do with it?" David had already decided. He transferred a large portion of the protected assets into a foundation created in Margaret's name. The foundation would fund scholarships and housing assistance for families across New York. The remaining assets were placed under Sarah's control with strict safeguards. Months passed. Evelyn was prosecuted for fraud and identity theft. Thomas faced charges, while Derek accepted a plea agreement. Andrew lost his position and began rebuilding his life away from Manhattan. He eventually wrote David a letter, "I thought your silence meant weakness. I was wrong. You were protecting the people you loved." David read the letter twice. He didn't immediately forgive his son, but he kept it. 1 year after the wedding, Sarah hosted a dinner at the same Westchester estate where she had once asked her father not to embarrass her. This time, she stood before the guests and said, "Everyone, this is my father, David Carter. He's the man who taught me that wealth means nothing without character." Richard Caldwell walked over and shook David's hand. "Boss," he said with a grin. The room laughed. David looked at Sarah. "You remember what you told me that night?" Sarah lowered her head. "I do. I was wrong." David handed her Margaret's photograph. "Your mother wanted you to have this." David had been humiliated in front of hundreds of people, but he never needed to humiliate anyone in return. His revenge was exposing the truth, protecting his daughter, and turning the wealth others tried to steal into something that would help thousands. As he left the estate, David looked back at the lights and smiled. They had called him a nobody because they judged him by his clothes. They never realized the quiet man sitting alone at the back of the wedding had the power to change the entire room. The lesson wasn't that David was secretly rich. It was that the people who underestimated him had revealed exactly who they were. He didn't destroy them. He simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices.